All right, it's a very interesting thought process that's been raised by Jeff Booth. Now, it's a very interesting concept because not many people realize this dichotomy that we live in between the untruth or fiat run system versus the Bitcoin truth network, as we call it. Now, why is this so important? Because it really underpins many aspects of the fiat system that we're in. In some ways, it propels the manipulation of the financial system for the collective, for the few, for the elite who is running it, because it's been shown time and time again that those who have the keys, that actually hold the keys to the financial system, are the ones that are going to be grappling the most wealth. And we are seeing it over the course of the centuries. There's always going to be a few percent of the world population that holds over 90% of the world's wealth, which is still the case, unfortunately. And this is typical symptom that we are seeing from the fiat system. It breeds greed, it breeds control, it breeds the manipulative behavior of this elite group that controls the system for their advantage, for their gain. I think this is what Booth is trying to explain, and that is the fiat run system that is the poison chalice on everything that we have or hold in terms of wealth. Now, if we move it over to the Bitcoin world, it's entirely the opposite picture, where we have fiat system on the one hand and Bitcoin on the other, and there are competing forces between the two. The savings that I originally have and still have to some degree in the fiat system is decaying, and I need to find an escape route away from that system into one of truth, into one of egalitarian, where everyone has an equal share of economic rights and wealth in the system, and fundamentally one that is truthful and cannot be tampered with. That for me is the takeaway of this snippet, which is very interesting and completely contrasts with how the fiat run system has been run and manipulated for several decades now, because it's, at the end of the day, it's a manipulated experiment run by that collective, run by that elite group, run by the central planners. And what I mean by central planners, the central banks that issue this paper money, is going to continue to be debased in value. And why Bitcoin is the light at the end of the tunnel, the escape route away from fiat into a more sound egalitarian approach, which is Bitcoin. And of course, you need to have a long-term horizon in order to capitalize the gain. If you hold the Bitcoin holdings to the long term in a secure, responsible manner, you will reap the rewards of that effort.
Yes.
Now, this is a very interesting concept and point raised by Booth. What he's trying to say here is where there's control, there is fraud, there is excessive abuse of power to continue to manipulate, to continue to hold their clutches onto the system in order to keep the level of control that they once have, in order to print more money and inject that money into the supply, into the economy, and devaluing our savings, devaluing our assets held in that system for their gain. And this just doesn't stop on the auspices of the economic system. It also has a downstream effect on other institutions, whether it's law, policy, or even government forces. They're all in it together. And this is the whole point that he's trying to make, that where there is centralized control, there is going to be continuing battle for power to gain from it. And really what he's trying to explain there is Bitcoin is indeed that answer, that safe haven, that parallel system, decentralized system that would free us from the control regime that we're in. In this decentralized system or realm, if you like, we're going to be free from control, we're going to be free from the clutches of the elite, from the governments, from the powerful, from the collective, and we'll free ourselves from the money printing corruption that's going on. It's completely corruptible, but in the case of Bitcoin, as we are seeing, there isn't that luxury of money printing. There isn't such a concept of money printing at all. And as a result, it's incorruptible in nature. It's the only truth ledger there is out there. and it's happening right now. Law and order only work when built on stable, truthful money, which mentions quite an interesting point about whether rich people actually need Bitcoin at all, in his view. And some of the rationale behind it, I can see where it's coming from, and it makes sense. I mean, if there's only one reason where I generally believe that they need Bitcoin, is to do with their heirs. When they inherit the wealth, so when the boomers, let's say, are no longer with us and they have to pass down their wealth, whether it's real estate, stocks, yachts, arts and collectibles, the heirs are not going to be interested at all in receiving that wealth in the 20th century style analog assets. They're not going to be interested in that at all. So that is a big concern for the boomers, who are starting to scratch their heads and think, well, what other asset can I generally pass on to my heirs who don't think the way I think? So that in itself is reason enough for them to consider at least converting their analog assets into Bitcoin. But there are other explanations as given in the clip. These institutions that I made reference earlier on, whether it's governments, authorities, banks, law enforcement, city councils, what have you, they're all under the old Fiat system, which is heavily controlled, based, and only serve the few, the powerful. And where there's unrest, and there is unrest, and we have seen in history that no matter the governments that take control of these institutions, or no matter the central bankers that take the realm of the central banking and the printing machine, there is going to be unrest. There is certainly that breakdown of trust in such institutions. And as a result, this impacts gravely on all of us that are reliant on those institutions to behave in a equitable, egalitarian, trustworthy sense, right, for the will and the interest of the people. And of course, most of these individuals are career politicians. So what I'm trying to say here is there isn't such thing as a trustworthy institution. So really, the only asset that is free from fiat, free from traditional finance or TradeFi is Bitcoin. It acts more as an equalizer asset in that it's the only way to protect at least a proportion of your assets. So going back to the early example of the boomer generation, who need to start worrying about the best means of passing on their wealth, is to start converting those 20th century style real estate properties or yachts or arts and collectibles and even stocks into Bitcoin, because the Gen Zs aren't going to be at all interested in receiving or inheriting that wealth. They would be interested in Bitcoin, certainly on stablecoins, and indeed digital assets would be my pick for the Gen Z generation and beyond, right? Because this is where the wind is blowing, mainly because Bitcoin, as I explained earlier on, is the only egalitarian system that we have that protects that wealth in a completely open, fair and transparent way in the decentralized network, which is Bitcoin. There's only going to be 21 million coins in circulation, so in that sense it's the most scarce asset that we will ever have in human history. So even the rich aren't going to be insulated from these problems of institutional control, taxation, counterparty risk. All encounter the same issues and faced with the same predicament. And particularly when the fiat system collapses, and it will happen. Don't ask me when, but there is experts out there are predicting the demise of the fiat system. So the only solution there is to turn to Bitcoin, at least to convert some of your wealth. So if you're one of the boomers out there or Gen Xers who are thinking about writing their will and testament, they ought to consider converting their analog assets into Bitcoin, at least a proportionate amount of that. About Bitcoin being scarce is an interesting point raised, and it kind of, I'm actually in the point where I've accumulated Bitcoin. So my journey is I bought into Bitcoin a few years ago, and have this kind of 10-year, 15-year period, which you probably have heard about from other Bitcoin investors out there. They're all advocating the same sort of time horizon, which in my case is no different, 10 years plus. And I'm at the point where I'm not just looking at it from a future generational wealth perspective in order to preserve my capital in Bitcoin and to grow it in the long term. I'm starting to think of it more of a liberating asset, and it's kindly deeply philosophical the way Jeff Booth explained this point, which I can resonate, because I'm at the point of the journey now where, I'm kind of weary about what to spend and how I'm going to spend it on. And also I look into other factors that are kind of important to me, like natural resources, how we should protect natural resources, whether it's energy, also into cheap labor. If you look into the countries he made reference, it's just not necessarily akin to third world nations, even to first world nations, right, in terms of devaluing their hard-earned income in fiat terms. That for me is an abuse, not just necessarily when it comes to manufacturing goods for the first world nations who are going to be the major purchasers of, let's say, the textile, the clothes that we wear. They are made in these third world nations, and therefore into the realm of child exploitation and cheap labor. But is also the same sort of abuse happening in the rest of the world in terms of devaluing our assets, our hard-earned income. That for me is an abuse under the auspices and control of fiat money, and how Bitcoin through scarcity can certainly provide that ultimate protection, which leads to fairness, that transparency, that level of openness and value-based trade. So we are all equitable, we are all having the same sort of economic rights in the system, and creating this new kind of capitalism, which is based on our contribution into the Bitcoin network. It's done so, but not by extraction, which is how the fiat system works. So this ethics-driven network, which is Bitcoin, is the ultimate vehicle that's going to help us to thrive as humanity when money is honest. That is, for me, what's really interesting from this clip. So by having a truthful, honest ledger, which is Bitcoin, is at that point when money is going to be deemed honest, which is an interesting way of thinking about it. Whether is Bitcoin religious? Does it have kind of it holds a certain amount of internal personal beliefs? That is an interesting question that is raised into the thesis of Bitcoin, because the more you unpeel, or you start to unravel as you do your own research and you're immersing yourself into the asset, whether it's through your own personal conviction and investment in the asset, it comes to a point where you start to hit the inevitable, I think, which is deeply personal and deeply philosophical, because we are seeing more people drawn into the asset, drawn into Bitcoin. And why they do it, they don't just do it for economic reasons. Of course, that is going to be one of the major factors why people invest in the asset, to escape, as I said before, from the clutches and the centralized fiat system. But they do it maybe for another reason, maybe perhaps for more deeper spiritual reason, that people may be drawn into Bitcoin as an asset, purely because, as I said, it's one of the most, perhaps the only truthful system there is out there. It offers that open transparency in terms of how and what people invest in the asset looks like. It also is coherent. It instills trust and a certain sense of purpose in a world full of entropy and chaos. And once you realize that, it's hardly surprising why people are more drawn into the Bitcoin asset, treating it more as a personal reason, a personal attachment. I think that word is appropriate. Attachment is a global asset. It's not something that is akin to a particular sect or religion. As a belonging to an asset, that you happen to evolve yourself or hold certain values in the system, because the system provides many things, not just economic savings technology, which is how perhaps has been started out by the majority of us investors into Bitcoin as a savings technology type asset. But as you get drawn into the asset, you're starting to unravel, as I said before, other attributes, other factors. So comparing this to how religion once unified communities, I wouldn't go far as that notion, but certainly as a shared belief system, in that it is based on math, it's based on energy, and it's one of the most egalitarian, libertarian asset for people as a whole, for the whole planet. Then that sense of attachment to the asset is how I would play it. And it's done now by Bitcoin. There's an interesting point about why Bitcoin transforms people. As I mentioned earlier on, we all started out investing into the asset purely for economic reasons, to store our wealth and to grow our wealth into the long term, so that our future generations, or even when we reach an age of retirement, we like to start enjoying the capital gains of Bitcoin in the long term. But it just doesn't stop there. For those of us who have been in the asset there for some time now, we're starting to see changes in the sense of our behavioral patterns, in terms of we'll start to think twice about what and how to spend our Bitcoin wealth. So it changes our patterns of consumerism to one of responsibility. So it's reshaping our values. So I see that as positive, because there's a lot of consumerism out there. Well, we're starting to see the values are changing for those who are invested in the asset, into Bitcoin. So in addition to that, I believe it also fosters other things like patience, collaboration, and that sense of curiosity and learning, and also how particularly it can help our next of kin or people around us. So these are the additional advantages, if you like to think of that in those terms, would provide. So people will become more focused, will become more ethical as a result of holding to the Bitcoin asset. You're starting to uncover other attributes within yourself, and also that long-term thinking. So saving for now in order to spend it at a later stage when you most need it, right? It could be that hip surgery. So it really brings additional attributes like emotions, and that psychological transformation happens as incentives change. So when the incentives change as a result of holding the asset, I think would unleash these attributes, as I mentioned earlier on: patience, collaboration, curiosity, become more focused, become more ethical, get into the habit of saving now in order to invest in the future. So that longer time horizon, I think, is rather interesting as a result of holding into Bitcoin, especially for those of us who've been holding into the asset for several years now. We are starting to unleash some of these interesting attributes, which I can only see as a positive, good thing. Moving away from just seeing it as an economic asset, there are other attributes and advantages that can be sought as a result of holding and investing this asset. So Bitcoin isn't just a new asset anymore, as we are seeing. It's a shift in how humans relate to time, value, and trust. The monetary layer of society, as a result, is being rewritten. We're early in a transformation that could indeed reshape every global system. So encouragement is to step up, to stay curious, and to be part of this major evolution, which is going to unleash, as I said before, more of a, in my own personal opinion, more of a humanitarian type system. One that is truthful, one that cannot be manipulated. So if you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to hit the like button, to share the video to other friends and colleagues at work. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe to my channel, as I regularly publish interesting videos such as these, anything to do with Bitcoin, blockchain technology, and the future of finance. So till next time.